Evil eye. Talking of evil eyes, the ego, Latin eye, is it evil? Or is that just a conceptualization that has become like modern narrative, that the ego is a bad thing?
Depends on how you look at it. I think, yeah, mainstream ego stands for kind of like that false pride and that relative comparison. But technically speaking, you told me it stands for I, just the I. The self?
Mm-hmm. I guess our identification with who I is in the equation. I think it's become like, the problem is there's you, who you identify as, and that's become separate from I am. And I think that is the individualization of is where the trouble comes in. Like you have the term big ego, meaning that that person is more concerned with themselves than their surroundings or the people that they're with. They're more concerned about I than the people that they're with.
So they have less vision on others and less focus on others and an overemphasis on the self.
Mm-hmm.
How much of that is a function of you not having freed up enough capacity to expend on others? I guess the other way around is, how much are you still preoccupied with self and what you really stand for? And how much of that then sort of prohibits you from expending excessive energy on others? Like the more you're focused on self, the more you're focused on your status, the more you're focused on your shortcomings, the more you're focused on your insecurities, the less you're able to expand your viewpoint on others. This kind of thing, you have to fill up your own cup before you have enough capacity to expend on others. I guess the problem with that ego is you never really fill up the cup to that extent because it's never ending. If the view is only on self through the ego, there's always going to be a reference point that signals to you that it's not enough and you have to fill it up more and more and more.
Yeah, I think it's like an awareness thing. Like we always talk about awareness. So it's our ability to be less reactive in the moment, I suppose, because the ego is the most reactive part of us. It's the part of us that has built our identity, and it's when we attach too much of ourselves to our identity. I am this way. This is who I am, and I must protect that at all costs. Then we are the least able to kind of grow. When we're clinging on, our ego wants to stay the same. Our ego, it's the thing that doesn't want to grow. It wants to remain with it's figured it out. It's the part of us that believes that we already have the answers. So if we are to take the stance that there is always some sort of a lesson to be learned from any situation, any person, any understanding of an emotion that's arising within us. Say for example, you're at a table and someone says something you don't agree with, and then you notice, oh, I'm getting angry, or I need to correct them, like as if you have the answer that they don't, like they're missing the point or something. That's your ego that's rising at that point. Your desire to kind of be the one that sets it straight.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way for you to know. That's still only your viewpoint. That's your, or maybe you're right. Maybe categorically you're right. But it's still your ego that wants to correct the situation. I noticed yesterday I was having a talk with someone on the rooftop, J Dubs. And this guy is somebody that's definitely talking a lot in the conversation. But he's very smart. So there's lots of stuff coming at you. And I noticed myself wanting to kind of, I don't know, like not put him straight, but I wanted to get a word in edgeways. But two, I wanted to keep him open. Because it felt like he was giving me some kind of a lesson on something. But perhaps he was. The lesson was that I need to be more open because, almost how dare I tell someone that they need to be more open if I'm the one saying that. That's a paradox. So I needed to kind of just stand, and I have to do this a lot more. I'm practicing this a lot in conversations where I notice that I want to say something or interject, and I'm practicing just sort of sitting and observing. I think, again, that's the ego. Like, the ego wants to interject. The ego wants to have their point made. So the more that you can sit and observe, the less you are the ego.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The ego is also, I think the Hindus call it the monkey brain as well. I think when we refer to the ego, it's literally just, it's your temporary self. It's that version of, from childhood to now, that the story you've built about yourself, about who you are, what your name Mark stands for, your beliefs, sort of your occupation, your identity, how other people view you. You're the funny, charismatic guy, the popular guy who's social. Like, all that's part of the ego. It's the story, the narrative you tell yourself about yourself. And I think that everything you build around that, it wants to survive. Everything you've told yourself you are, which is part of the ego, it allows you to navigate reality. It allows you to reduce entropy. It allows you to give you some idea of where you stand. It almost gives you certain security about who you are and what you are and how other people view you. And that energetic entity, the ego, the self, it wants to stay. So every time you try to open up and say, oh, hold on, listen, that's like the thing that's like, no, I know it better. I've allowed you to survive until here, so let me just interfere. So it's the constant battle between the ego and then your higher self, which is, that awareness, shifting to that bird's eye perspective. And for some people, it's more present. I would say we all have that ego. It's a spectrum. It's not black or white. It's not like you have an ego or you don't. We all have an ego. But some people have that under control better than others. And some people dispositionally, as part of their, when I say dispositionally, I would just say as part of their upbringing, the environment that they were brought up in, they have a stronger attachment to the ego than others. In my culture, for example, Persian culture, it's extremely status driven, and everything that's very status driven is driven by external visibility, such as gender, such as wealth, such as age. So all of those play into the visible status of a person, and that person is defined based on that. And whenever you define yourself based on an external entity, you're defining yourself based on that ego, because that's the story you make up about yourself. Oh, I am that, and I am that, and I am that. If someone does not sign off on that, I feel a certain way about it. So I was raised in an environment where it was very much, you have to respect older people. They define themselves based on their age and their wisdom. Mm-hmm. It's directly correlated with, oh, if you're old, you must have wisdom, which can be true, but a lot of times it isn't, right? But you occupy a certain place in the hierarchy based on your age. And then the other thing is occupation. Like, what academic title have you earned? That's going to also dictate how you're respected. So I was raised in that environment. So for me, naturally, that sense of ego and who I am derived from those accolades is stronger than for someone that is not brought up in an environment like that. So a huge challenge of my wrestling with God is breaking through that ego constantly, because that thing is very strong with me. It wants to be there. And the worst thing I figured I can do is try to reject it. That hasn't worked. That just manifests itself strongly somewhere else. It's a very sneaky thing, the ego, It's very good at what it does, which is it thinks it allows you to survive. It's not against you. It thinks it allows you to survive, and it purely operates on that. It's an impersonal energy, if you want to talk about it like that. And for me to bring that on board was the thing that was difficult and still is, but you're getting better as you go.
Yeah, and you know what? It reminds me of last week's conversation about intuition. I think actually the voice that convinces you to do things is the ego. That's the part of you that wants to stay the same or be stroked, you know? It's okay, you do the thing. Let's stay where we're at. This is good here.
Yeah.
But then there's the higher self, or I would argue your future self, the oldest version of you.
Yeah.
And that's your soul that speaks to you. And I agree with the age being something that brings wisdom, because with age comes experience, and experience is what is giving you the wisdom. So the older people in a group should be revered. I think it's something that's kind of lost. It's a traditional approach, but I think it stands true. When I think about my nan, for example, like she had wisdom that I was blind to see when I was too young, because again, my ego was in the game. So she'd come over and I would just be all about the stuff. I knew best, 13 years old. I knew nothing, but I wanted to act like I did. And I'm at the risk of getting a click around the ear hole because she did know best, but I was just not ready to hear it then. And now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the only way I get to hear it is in my head when I think about how she would react or think about certain situations, because she's no longer here. So you want to be getting a hold of your ego quickly enough so that you can actually have those messages told to you in real time, rather than having to then you know, talk to people when they're not here anymore.
Yeah. I agree with that to a large extent, even though I would also put in an asterisk. It's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee for you to have wisdom with age. It really depends on what you did with your experiences, and also how much. It's not just enough to go through experiences and difficult situations in life. It's also how you navigate through them, right? And for example, how my father navigated through his hardships was very much ego driven. Like, he was not willing to break out of the ego. It was always, I am the man. I am older than his wife, than my mom, older. I came from Iran to Germany as a 16-year-old, not speaking the language, not having any money in my pockets, coming and working as an intern for some Germans. And back in the day, like, it was way more kind of like people against foreigners than it is now. There were not a lot of like black-haired people in Germany. It was way closer to after the war. So it was kind of new to have people from different cultures living in Germany. So my dad, looking like that, not speaking any German, they were all like, he told me a couple of times, they were telling him, why don't you go back to your country, like that type of thing. So he had to like persevere in that environment, and then bring over my mom, and then they had me, and he had to build from zero. So what allowed him to push through that was this I'll show everyone, you know, this strength coming from the ego, which is directly tied to the survival. It allowed him to survive and persevere. But he kept that on forever. It served him for some time, and then it controlled him after that. And he never was able to become aware of when it started to control him and where it was limiting him. The ego is, like I said, there for you to survive, but life is not only about survival. It's about spiritual growth. That's where the ego caps if you don't get it under check, and when you don't bring it on board. And so for him, in that specific example, every decision he made was on external visibility. What are people going to think about us? You know, how am I going to look? So all of that is, he's now defining who he is based on how he looks to others, which means that you are imprisoning yourself, because you can never be your authentic self, because it only depends on what other people think of you. And because of that, you're going to start to, a lot of times, act out of force and top-down pressure. So you can, and I don't call it dominate, but a lot of people confuse acting from the ego with domination, because maybe you have people that are depending on you financially, for example. And so you can be the strong guy. It's as I say, and you listen, and you think you're dominating. What you're actually doing is you're making use of a dependent relationship, let's say of your wife or your children, that are just tolerating that type of behavior because they need you. And in the moment they don't, they move away from you. Same with friends, same with family relationships, whatever, right? So it's strength being actually mistaken for strength. It's actually weakness. It's a facade of strength. And to hold on to that for too long, it actually is extremely counterproductive. So if I would be listening to that type of experience, I would have to act out that type of behavior that, let's say in this case, my dad thinks is right. But being aware, I also know where it capped him. So yes, there is some wisdom with age, but you have to be very, very careful. And I think for me, it's looking at the person and thinking, is this the type of life and the life environment that I would strive towards when I'm old? Did that person kind of like have a career that they found fulfilling? Do they have good family life? Do they have a lot of friends? Do they seem at peace when you're interacting with them? If all of that is present, it's like, oh, okay, let me actually very, very much learn from that person. I'm curious, what did they go through? But if that is not given, it's actually a good thing to also be cautious, because you can follow a lead and advice and experience and literally just imitate something that gets you in the same position. So if that's not the position you want to get into, you best off not following those footsteps. So it's being aware of that. So yes, age is good, but also not a guarantee.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we can look directly at the president of this country and say that guy has an ego. I don't think there's anyone that's going to argue with that. But arguably, that's also what's allowed him to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you draw the line between those two things then? Like, how is it that you talk about your dad, and that also allowed him to be able to present himself in a certain type of a way, and to be honest, bring the family through in a situation where it's very difficult, where he wasn't welcome in that country, and now you're at that point, like you obviously recognize your ego and your tendency to either rely on it or be caught by it, perhaps. How do you then draw the line between not being that way, but also still using it somehow to your benefit?
Yeah, I think it's the realization that acting from the ego, thinking it's strength, what it actually meant to me, realizing that was that it was a type of weakness. So for example, if you define yourself based on other people following you in a certain way, let me give you an example. Let's say you have a fight with your girlfriend and you're like, I'm not going to text her, I'm not going to call her. It's up to her. It's up to her to do it. I am this and that. I'm the guy of this status and that status, and I'm that popular and I'm like that. So that's the ego. That's a very, very well-known example of the ego, because I know a lot of people, especially guys, acting from that. Okay, so let's say you do that. 2 days go by, 3 days go by. You stood strong. You didn't text. You didn't call your girlfriend. She gives in. She calls you. Hey, let's talk about that. Huh? See? I knew that she would call. I don't have to do that. Okay. Now you think you're strong because of that, because she was the one breaking and calling you. What you don't realize is those 2 or 3 days where you were angry and distressed, waiting for her to call, and now she calls, and now your ego is satisfied. Actually, that person is dictating your emotional state, because up until her calling and making up with you, you felt a certain type of way. So now that she's making you feel a bit more relieved and at peace, because now you think, oh, okay, I'm worthy of something, but I'm only worthy of something because she came back and called me. If you look at it objectively, it's a weakness, because you're not convinced about yourself that you're worthy. You needed her to come and essentially act this way and call you to confirm that you're the one in charge. But you didn't know yourself. You only were in charge because she called. Now, when you realize that that's actually a facade of strength, it just looks like you're strong. You can tell everyone, oh, I'm not the one that calls. I'm not the one that does that. You're defining your self-worth based on how other people are treating you. That's always a weakness. Realizing that that's always a weakness, and the real strength actually comes from knowing, being aware of that ego that wants you to just wait and prove that you're worthy until that person comes and approaches you, and actually being the one making that first step. Because now you are the one dictating your own emotional state. Forget about the other person. Forget about that girlfriend. Forget about that friend, whoever that may be. The moment you do that and you overcome that ego, now you are the one that is directly softening that emotional state. You don't need that other person for that anymore. Actually, that is being in charge, because now you're emotionally resilient and the other person will follow you as a result. So it was the realization of that for me. I was like, man, I got it all wrong. Really, like, doing that is acting out of the ego in these situations. It's a weakness. It allows you to keep that facade of strength that is entirely built externally. The car, the wife, how other people treat you, the status, like all of that stuff, it's just you hiding behind it because you don't want to, you're not able to overcome your ego in these situations. That's a way harder thing to do.
Yeah, and that's you acting from your feeling state. That's you reacting to the thing, whatever the conflict is, whether it's with your partner or in any kind of relationship, friend, business, whatever. You're in a situation where you don't agree on something, and then it requires one of you to be the bigger person, to actually throw in the towel and to say, you know what, we both want the same thing here. Fundamentally, we're in a relationship. Fundamentally, we're in a partnership, friendship. Whatever it is, we have the same goal, but we're arguing about the details. What's our goal here? What did you actually mean? Was I listening? Were you listening to respond instead of listening to understand? When you remove all of the facade part of it, you actually get to the root cause of the problem. This is another JP thing. I remember him saying that whenever he has arguments with Tammy, he's going to go back and have a conversation. Okay, that conversation is going to continue happening until you get to the actual root cause of what the problem is. It's not the fact that she leaves the top off the toothpaste. It's the fact that underneath that, there's some part of you as a child that's still not healed from something. It's hard to find that part of ourselves. It's hard to admit that because it comes down to us having to do the admitting.
I agree with that. It's also the degree to which you define yourself based on that voice within you. Like when you speak specifically about childhood, the first thing that comes to mind is like, who does she think she is that I have to go and message her or call her? How dare she? Like that's a childhood voice that, based on the environment you were brought up in, this like masculine top down a lot of times, that makes it very difficult to yet do the right thing. Intuitively, you know, I know, and I always knew intuitively, that's not the right thing to do. But the ego was like, and every time that ego is fed again, because let's say the person comes and messages you or calls you, in this case the girlfriend, the ego is like, see, told you, man, you're stronger than that, you're better than that, you don't have to do that. It gets more difficult every time this is actually working. And that's why a lot of times when you're a man of a certain status, if you have high status, you have money, you're good looking, that's why it's so difficult to break out of that, because a lot of times you're getting your way with that. Best example, Donald Trump, but there's so many examples of that where it's like, that person is financially dependent on you, maybe socially dependent on you. So you're in that positional power and you can milk that, but you're milking that at the same time milking your soul to some extent,
Yeah.
And the other thing was, I see that this specific type of dynamic with men towards women a lot with friends that I grew up, because they grew up in similar households as I did. Was very much masculine, feminine role, it was purely based on force. It was based on age and the fact that the guy is a man. The father is in that household. So you're essentially just occupying a position purely based on that status. It's not earned. It's purely because you are that, and maybe you make money, and so because of that, you occupy that role. So there needs to be, of course, you have to be subordinate to me. So that's the idea, right? And I see that a lot with my friends continuing. When they grow up, they essentially resemble that same relationship pattern. And part of that type of relationship dynamic is also, if you as a guy are not willing to grow spiritually, you essentially have to have that dynamic, because it allows you to feel a certain level of strength. You only define yourself based on having that power, let's say, over your wife or over your partner. So based on that, this is who you are, right? That's because you're not willing to grow. It's essentially, I tell you how high to jump, you ask me how high I should jump. Whereas if you view a relationship as a playground to elevate spiritually, then you can use this ego as a way to break through when you don't use it against your partner, but you overcome it and it's allowing you to level up. But you need to have that growth mindset when it comes to your spiritual evolution. If you don't want that, if you just want that security of defining who you are based on that relationship dynamic, you'll always keep that person small. So a lot of it is, if you ever made that decision, I think a lot of that is subconsciously, but deciding, do I just want to stay where I am and define myself based on that dynamic? Then perfect. Actually, I see that with a lot of my friends. They don't really care for spiritual evolution. But if that's not what you want, then what you want is a partner that allows you to grow spiritually. And that the prerequisite for that is to select against the ego a lot of the times to do that. So a lot of it's your choice.
Okay, let me just kind of reframe on a couple of those things. Are you suggesting that the ego is to retain as much power as you can then, from your perspective, like of yourself and your decisions? That's your kind of
every time. Yes, to answer your question, but also something else. The ego, to me, the ego can be framed as your survival self. It just wants to survive. You have your five senses.
Survive as in stay in the same place. Is not
stay in the same.
And not concerned with when you say not concerned with spiritual growth, aka not concerned with evolution. Then
correct. Well, spiritual evolution specifically, because spiritual growth means uncertainty. It also means a rewriting of your belief systems. So all of that
spiritual growth does mean that, but then so does progression in the world.
Right. So what the ego does, in a nutshell, is it wants you to survive physically. So every time there is a situation,
doesn't the ego want you to progress physically? No. Is that what you're saying? It doesn't.
It does want you to progress physically, not necessarily spiritually,
right?
Because it's a temporary self.
But what I'm asking then, in terms of being disagreeable, is who is to say that spiritual evolution is better than physical evolution? That is the reductionists are going to argue. The atheist would argue, why do I need to spiritually grow when I can grow physically? When I can grow through the accumulation of wealth for my family and community?
And you can. You see, there is a lot of, and I would even make a case that this is better than being completely, than thinking life doesn't mean anything. So there is, I think you make a very valid point, because you can accumulate a lot of wealth and a lot of status through purely pushing through the ego. It's like, I'll be better, I'll be stronger, I'll be faster, I'll work out, I'll work harder than everyone else, right? You can do all of that. And I would say this is better than someone that is in apathy and is just can't move and is just like lethargic and it just has given up on life. This is 100% better than that. However, I would say there is an alternative to that, which is I will invest in my spiritual evolution. And my spiritual evolution means that there is something transcending the I, transcending the self, and transcending the ego. And as a result of that, I will be identifying with things in my life that I'm naturally pursuing as I am elevating spiritually, that will bring all of the things that the ego drive would bring, but from a place of calm. Why? Because every time you push, you use the ego. And a good example is, for example, people like Andrew Tate, super smart, strong, highly ego driven. I'll be stronger than you. I'll outwork you. I'll make more money than you. You get all of that, right? The question is, how much peace does that bring with you? Because you're chasing something visibly, externally visible. You get there, but you don't really get there, because then there's the next thing you're chasing. You're building your life purely based on these externalities that you're chasing. And you're getting there through the ego. You're strong, but you're never arriving really at a place of peace and fulfillment, because you need to feed yourself these external status symbols at all times, because you define yourself based on that. So to answer your question, yes, like if you look at it as progression, sure, that is progression. I would say that's progression. That's temporary progression. If you look at just your lifetime, if you look at it as you're 90 years alive, sure. But if you talk about spirit and soul, not necessarily. And comes to mind, Galatians 6:7. It's a verse I read this weekend, is, do not think you can mock God. You will reap exactly as you sow. If you sow based on the desires of the flesh, the ego, the I, you will reap destruction. If you sow based on the soul and on the spirit, you will reap eternal life. And I think that's what it is. Because when you act based on the ego, you think you want all of that. The money, the cars, and the girl, and the house, and all of that. This is the ego. It's the flesh. Now you're essentially sowing based on the ego. You get all of that. You get the car, the house, and the flesh. Does that mean that you find a certain level of peace within? I would argue that's absolutely no guarantee. Whereas when you go and you put the eggs in the basket of spiritual evolution, I would make the case that you can get all of that plus a level of fulfillment and peace and balance that otherwise isn't possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that, because the flesh is the binge mentality. So that's the never-ending rabbit hole of, well, I've got the one thing, I want the next thing, I want the next thing. You know, it's never going to be big enough. It's never going to be enough. You're constantly going to want more double-deckers, more sugar. Let's go. And Andrew Tate's an interesting example, because he is somebody that has really rubbed people up the wrong way, but has been very successful at doing it.
Yeah.
So it's confusing to many people. And then there's people that are absolutely gung-ho, you know, championing his viewpoint. And there's people who are dead against it and can't stand the guy. But somewhere in the middle of that is a man that's trying to figure something out with himself and has had some sort of an upbringing. You know, he's still a human that has, you know, arguably gone through some stuff, and he's using his ego as that tool to understand who he is. And also, isn't he Hindu?
He's Muslim.
Muslim.
Yep. He's Muslim.
So he's actually in some sort of a discovery period of himself at the moment, and everything that's happening to him, including probably being put in prison, is a part of his growth. And he's beginning to understand who he is and what his real place is in terms of his spiritual growth.
Absolutely.
The interesting part as well, you said something about milking. Remember when you said that?
Yeah.
I instantly had a bit of a dirty thought, but I was actually thinking of like, well, we massage the ego. So there's some kind of self-masturbation that's going on with the ego.
Sure.
It's you getting yourself off on yourself.
That's very, very true. And I think if you think about it very primitively, it confirmed your survival. Because for a moment there, you were shaky. I don't know what's going to happen. Is she going to text? Is she going to call? Is this going to break apart? So there is, I think that resembles the, evolutionarily speaking, that sound in the bush. You know, what is that? Is that the lion? Is that something coming to eat me? So that situation in itself, it kind of triggers that same response. But then she comes and it's like, oh, let's figure this out. I want to come back to you. It's like, it's almost like, oh, okay, I survived. The ego is like, it seems to play itself out in sophisticated ways, masqueraded as sophisticated. But really what it is, am I surviving? Am I surviving? Oh, yeah, I'm surviving. I'm good. And then it does the same thing again. So becoming aware of that is very, very useful, because also it keeps you in that loop of chasing something to feel something, chasing something to feel something. Every time you reach that, she messaged you, I feel at peace. Every time you get the new car or the promotion on the job, you feel like that. So essentially what you're doing is you are dictating your feeling state based on people and environments and circumstances. If I get there, then I will be this, and then I will feel this.
And it needs to be upside down. It needs to be the other way around.
Yes.
We need to kind of realize that the ego is talking to us at certain points then, and then use that as a understanding, I'm being triggered by this thing now. Right, okay, what does that mean? Like, what can I unpack here? Like, what thing from my childhood has this come from? Or what value is this opposing that I supposedly hold within myself that is something that I'm identifying as or with? And then questioning that. Is that right?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. And I think it's important to not declare war against your own ego, because that's another way of ego. It's bringing it on board and acknowledging that it allowed you to survive up until here. You know, the ego is very, very useful. Like, again, to go back to the example of my
Keep
dad.
your enemies close and your ego closer.
That's the main one, man. You want to have if you have your ego on board, bro, you're gonna go straight to the moon, man. Unless you know, if you can have that ego on the leash rather than a dog that's just roaming around wildly, it's such a useful thing to have, man.
That's a good analogy, actually.
You
the dog. Like,
yeah,
it's that kind of, but it can be, you can have it like, hey, wait, sit, it's ready.
Precisely.
And then when you tell it to do the thing, it attacks. But it does it under your command.
Yes.
Who's in control, your ego or you?
Well, I think that, yes, I mean, what comes to mind is you don't want to neuter yourself. You don't want to get rid of the ego, because then you go into apathy and victimhood. It's very easy to dissolve when things are hard and just feel like you can't move, man. You're just weak. That's where you want the ego. You don't want the ego to say, oh, I'm better than him. I have more money than him. I have the prettier girlfriend than him. I have the bigger house. You want the ego to say, bro, really? Is that what you're made of? Are you sitting here on the couch eating potato chips in your parents' basement?
So you kind of want to be able, so it can't be overflowing out of you. It's basically like your cup analogy that you were talking about. You want to fill up your cup, but not so that it's pouring out everywhere. It needs to be maintained and under control.
Under control. And it needs to be used against the part of you that wants to be weak and wants to be a victim. And we all have that to a certain extent. If you can use the ego for that, rather than for relative comparison and defining yourself based on where other people and other things rank in society, then you've brought it on board. And again, the ego is a step up from apathy. Like, if I know people that are just defeated, that life took them out, man. Like, they just feel sorry for themselves most of the time. And it's the saddest thing you can see. Those people, if they had a little bit of ego, if they had a little bit of that inner warrior, they would snap out of that. They would elevate from apathy to anger, to ego. That's actually a step up. So you have to look at it relative to where that person is. But then from that ego state, you can also take that upward and say, well, at the ego state, you can reach absolute financial success and success of status. Absolutely. But you can also transcend that domain of ego towards spiritual evolution, where now you're not operating purely based out of ego, but you're taking the ego, you're internalizing it in order to overcome the parts of you that just want to be weak. And then the ego is not externally focused outwardly, it's now an internal tool. You're using that against yourself. And that in itself will not lead to me comparing myself to you and to that and to that. It's then just there to say, oh, okay, you want to be weak? No. You're made of a different material. But it's not like I'm better than Mark. Oh, Mark, I'm better than Puya. That's the classic ego, the way we define it. And that's a lot of work. But if you can get a grip on that ego, you want to have the ego as your central striker, number 9 on the team.
Yeah, you're making me think of athletes anyway when you're talking about that, because there's an instant correlation to egos and people who've been very successful in sport. Michael Jordan would be an example of somebody that may be considered to have a big ego, but I mean, rightly so. He's used that in order to become the greatest of all time. LeBron, another example. But do they have big egos, or is it just something that we're observing that actually is part of us that we're missing?
Yeah.
You know, Cristiano Ronaldo, Messi. One of those is going to have a bigger ego than the other one to the observer. But both of them have been and are still argued about who's the best of all time. Because they are both the best of all time, but one of them has got a bigger ego than the other one.
No, Messi is, but go ahead.
Well, true. But we both agree on that. But then again, that's going to be something that you can argue till you're blue in the face with some people about.
Sure.
That ego, when you see it in other people who've been extremely successful in their chosen domain, actually is the thing that's gotten them to that point. And, you know, at that level, they have managed to some degree to keep that in check. What makes you think that Cristiano Ronaldo has such a massive ego?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I think he very much... I feel like the more you base your state of being on visible external goals, the more you're going to be driven by the ego. If I have that, then I will be. If I do not have that, then I will not be. I don't know Cristiano Ronaldo, so it's a difficult thing for me to answer, but the accolades, of course, speak for him. But it also almost seems like there's always this guy, man, this guy Messi, that he seems to not be so about it.
But how do we know that's ego and not just pure passion? Like, he obviously lives for football. If it was you, would you not want to win for your country? Is that ego? Or is that just like...
It's hard.
What part of you... I mean, yeah, Cristiano Ronaldo's always posing, got his abs out, and that's not Messi's style. But does that mean that Ronaldo has the ego? Or is that just who he is? Like, Bex is someone that you wouldn't necessarily say has an ego, but he's also modeling all the time, da-da-da-da. Some people might be like, oh, he's got an ego too.
Again,
like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, it's hard to draw it. I think both... I mean, when you reach that level, you have used the ego for you. To get to that point, you have to have the ego on board. So those people transmuted that energy to use it when they want to give up, to just keep going and to level up. Those are masters of their craft. David Goggins, different example of that. I think to a certain extent, it's about, if you define success as success on the status realm and the financial realm, the sports realm, sure. The question is, does getting to that point, reaching those goals, is that going to give you a certain level of peace and fulfillment? Because if not, it allowed you to get all the shiny objects. But if the shiny objects do not give you that feeling that you thought they will give you, then a lot of times you can be stuck, man.
Yeah, I agree with you. But I mean, like, dude, like, think about the Buddha. Imagine being so brazen to say, I am the Buddha. Imagine being so brazen to say, I am Jesus. Kanye West does. So that's ego, is it?
I don't know, is it?
I don't know. Jesus said, I am God. I mean, imagine what people must have thought at that time. Even now, some people do not subscribe to that. Jews are an example. They just do not subscribe to the fact that Jesus says, I am the Messiah. That's the differentiator between Jewish faith and Christian faith. Because they would, I guess, potentially even argue that that's ego for someone to claim that they are the Lord.
Yeah.
How do you, like, that's a crazy interpretation then.
Not if you actually read the Bible in detail. If Joel 3:10 says, let the weak men say they're strong and let the poor men say they're rich, then there is a certain level of commanding in there, right? So I can say that I am that which other people do not see. That's even in the religious text. And I would say that it's absolutely a prerequisite for you to become that. You need to be able to say that. So if you look at it from that way.
So you can say, I am all.
You can say whatever you want to say, man. Like, it's not up to me to say. I think you can say whatever you feel like saying. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, so then how do you make sure that in the process of understanding that you are the entire universe, you also remain humble to the fact that you are just a flicker of a piece of dust through space? Like that's such a massive spectrum, like you're saying. The ego is a spectrum. Okay, so you have some understanding that you're absolutely everything that ever existed and never will exist, but you're also nothing at the same time. Like you're the inside of a black hole, and you're all of the stars that have ever been created. Sometimes it can be easy then to get lost in your ego, to get lost in the fact that, oh, I'm stardust. Okay, cool. Then let's just go do the thing.
You're asking very difficult questions.
That's a tough one, though, isn't it?
I love those questions, man. Let me think about this. These are the type of questions you cannot rationally explain. So every time I can't rationally explain something, I would probably just revert to how do I feel when I say such a thing. In Kanye's example, if you say I am, what does he say? I'm Jesus? Is that what he says?
His name's literally Ye.
Okay, if he says I am Jesus, if you're aware of the place you come from when you say such a thing, you will be able to actually see, is that person coming from a state of superiority, the false ego, I am better than everyone else? Or does that come from a state of awakening to not only who he is, but also who everyone else is? So I would say I'm not in his body to sense when he says, I am that, if he's saying, I am that. That's one way of saying it, right? And the other way of saying it is, yeah, I am Jesus. And so are you, and so is everyone else. So those are two very different ways of saying that. Right?
Yeah. The tricky part is because he's an artist. So he's kind of saying it, but you never really know. And even if you interviewed him, he still kind of would be difficult for you to be able to distinguish. Is he serious? Or like, does he mean that? Like he's also saying he's an artsy. And then at the same time, he's saying, I am a god, hurry up with my damn croissants. You know? This guy is everywhere. That's the thing. That's the fascinating part about him. And maybe a sort of market ploy and he's just an absolute genius, which is also probably the case.
Sure.
Like he's all of those.
So then, how to get your ego in check? If you know, let's say you're aware of the fact that your ego is not serving you anymore, it's controlling you more. In terms of becoming aware of it, and then in terms of practical tools, how are you able to bring that on board?
That's the thing, because you'd have to be that. The prerequisite for that is that you're aware that it's in control, and you don't think it's your intuition or something like that, like you were talking about last week. You have to be aware that it is in control, that some voice is there that's guiding you rather than your soul. I think the difference between those two things, to be able to tell whether it's your ego or your soul, is whether it is benefiting the group rather than yourself. You have to be able to distinguish whether it's for you. Like, is this something that I want, or is it something that I'm providing? Life is a gift, so we should be giving it then. But that doesn't mean you give it to yourself. That means that you give it out to other people. If the universal currency of the universe is love, yeah, you should have self-love, but you should also be giving love away. I think there's a Mark Twain quote about, you know, if you want, or if you want love, give it away, something like that, which is sweet, poetic, but also damn right, that's true. You don't get anything unless you've given it away, because once again, that's the rule, isn't it? You can't find your keys unless you've lost them. So the prerequisite to be able to receive anything is that you've become open enough for it to come through. You have to welcome it, and then you have to give it away.
That's a very good practical tool. just giving and serving. And
I mean, that's the Christian kind of viewpoint for it, I think.
I think another thing is being aware that the ego operates from survival, and every time there is survival, there is fear. So what is the thing that you're afraid of that you're masquerading with that ego? Like in the case of your girlfriend and you fighting and you not wanting to text her, because if you text her, then you're putting yourself underneath her, so she needs to be texting you. What are you afraid of? You're probably afraid of having to downgrade who you think you were in terms of occupying a specific status. If she doesn't text me and I do that first, I'm giving up that status. I'm afraid of that. Why am I afraid of that? Because all my life I thought I am there, but now I have to go there if I do this, right? So you define yourself based on that status. And then it's the realization that actually you are the one ranking yourself, but you're making yourself dependent on someone else's ranking towards you based on how they behave towards you. So I think one thing to sit with is, what is it that's satisfying my ego that I'm actually afraid of? What would I have to give up that my ego wants to hold on to?
Yeah, what are you afraid of losing?
Yeah.
It's interesting when it comes to relationships as well, because there's always some kind of an internal struggle between who is dominant in the relationship versus the other person. But it doesn't need to be that way. Sometimes you're going to be giving more than the other person, and sometimes they're going to be giving more than you are. That is the dynamism of the relationship. It's never as simple as 50-50. Sometimes you've got to support them. Sometimes you're going to need some support. That's what the relationship is. Mutual growth towards the same goal. And the goal is growth. The goal is evolution. The goal is encouraging each other to be the best versions of yourselves. And to your point that you made earlier, it's actually to give that love to yourself in order that you have the capacity to give it to them. If you're a guy that's trying their best, but is also still a bit of a dick, it doesn't matter what relationship you're going to get into, it's not going to last very long. Because you're putting yourself first, as in your goals. It's more important that I achieve this, and then they can come along for the ride. It has to be put into you in terms of your emotional and spiritual growth, your level of leveling up in terms of maturity. Then you have more love to give, more compassion, more kindness, more generosity. And that's not an economic thing. That's purely for your ability to grow within yourself and therefore provide more for the family, and the family extends out to the planet. How do you become the best member of your society? And your society is humankind.
I think for everything you said, you need humility. And again, because we live on a plane of duality, everything exists in pairs. It's always useful to think about what's the opposite of acting from the ego. It's like acting from humility, right? So I think to overcome the ego, a very practical tool would be just doing the things that humble you.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that's helping other people, whether that's just doing something for someone else, putting someone else first, whether that is doing something that your ego is telling you not to do. By definition, that's overcoming the ego. So that moment where you're like, oh no, I'm not going to be the one that makes the first step. If you can make the first step there, you're actually training your ego. You're choosing humility over ego.
Catch yourself in that then,
Yeah.
I'm not going to, if the word I'm's in there, it's already, it's your ego talking shit to you.
Mm.
If you can catch the use of the monkey chatter saying I or I'm, you know exactly where it's coming from. And that's the thing that you've got to try and supersede. That's got to be hard.
It's very hard because that's another thing. It's the voice, the monkey voice that you're talking about. And another one that gives it away is a strong feeling. Whenever the emotion is over there, that
when
anger
you can feel
or pride,
yourself.
that's 100% of the time the ego. So, and the problem with that is because emotions are so strong, on a neurological level, they overwrite your ability to respond rather than to react. Because every time you're aroused emotionally, it's your amygdala, it's the fight or flight. So the blood and oxygen is predominantly sent to your limbs to literally fight or flight. And so a lot of times, your prefrontal cortex, which is required for you to regulate yourself emotionally, is turned down. It's not shut off, but it's turned down. And even your physiology is set up in a way that makes it, the odds are against you to overcome the ego and the emotional response tied to the ego. But if you can become aware of that, actually, what happens is you can regulate your emotional state by just realizing, abstracting from that emotional state. And that's training. The quicker you can snap out of that emotional state, automatically now the prefrontal cortex is more involved. And then you can shift perspectives. That's the first thing you realize when you snap out of an ego. It's like, oh, maybe she is right. Let me consider what they said. Yeah, I can see that. That's the first response after you snap out of the ego. That's your prefrontal cortex now giving you different flashlights, different perspectives. And then you regulate yourself that way. So the quicker you can do that, the quicker you get a grip on your ego and the emotional response attached to the ego.
Yeah, and it's harder to do that when it's something that you really care about in life. Like if you've been trying to achieve something in your career, or if you've been, if it's something that's really important to you, it's hard for you to then accept that maybe it didn't work out the way that you thought it was going to work out, and then remove your ego from that situation and be neutral with it.
And the more it's fundamental to your outlook on reality, the more it's fundamental to your belief system, right? If I say something that goes completely against what you believe to be true, you're way more likely to defend that and respond to it because it's a fundamental belief system. And again, the ego is there to help you survive. So the belief that you formed was there for you to get a grip on reality. This is how you view reality and how you can frame the chaos of reality into something more structured. So if I attack that, the first thing you do is hold on to it. So how dare you, So the ego comes in because it thinks it helps you survive there. So it's being aware of the processes that go on within you. So absolutely.
So it's basically defining what emotions are truly yours, kind of trying to see that from as objective a viewpoint as possible so that you can unpack who you really are, what you stand for, what your objectives are to try and achieve the best parts of you in every relationship, every event, every circumstance. Looking beyond your own individual goals. I mean, it's great to have your goals. It's great. They're gonna direct you, but at some point you have to start thinking about the family, people that are around you. It seems like a younger kind of mindset to have. This is again playing back into the with age comes wisdom. And I understand what you're saying with the asterisk. Yeah, always have your wits about you. Doesn't necessarily always work out that way. But generally speaking, the more experience that you gather, assuming that you're learning from it, the more wisdom comes with that. And then you actually have some kind of a duty to feed that back to the younger generation. Because the younger generation, and I'm an example of this, because 20-year-old me is out there flying the flag. Mm. So any advice that I would give to myself back then would just be, sure, be exactly who you are, because you're going to get to a point in 20 years where you reflect on that and go, oh yeah, that was actually all part of. So everything that I go through, every trip, every failure leads me to a point, I would hope, that I've learned something about it and that I'm gaining more momentum because of understanding that those mistakes define the growth of who I'm becoming.
Mm-hmm. You need to pass through that in order to level up to some extent. That's what I like about Frederick Dodson. He speaks about, transcending or like moving through these energy levels. And it goes from like the lower energy levels, like anger and apathy, anger to pride, to like more mid-level range, which is the ego, goal setting, business, making money. It's a lot of like status, to transcending that, which goes towards consciousness and enlightenment, and that actually you need to like pass through those stages in order to get there. So is that what you're saying? In order for you to understand all of this, you had to go through your ego phase to some extent.
Yeah.
And you still are. Everyone is to some extent.
Yeah, there's
it's
no-
not like you
there's-
should.
no.
You live on a spiritual and a physical and a mental plane. Because you live on the physical plane, the ego will always be present with you. Rather than rejecting it, is bringing it on board. And one more thing that comes to my mind now that we talk about this is, because the ego is there for physical survival. Physical survival only knows black and white. So it knows survival and it knows death. So every time I can sense that I am demonizing or idolizing something, I know it's the two extremes and it's the ego involved.
That's a great way of looking at it.
So I'm projecting. It's not reality. I'm actually projecting. So when I'm projecting, I know that it is the ego. And so being aware when I'm like, this person's an idiot, this political party is just BS, and that person is that, or like, oh my God, like, I want to be like that. I want to have that, idolizing, right? So all of that is ego. The ego is it's not very nuanced. It's either black or white. It's not there for you to think in nuanced ways. It's there for you to survive. So it's realizing that, and realizing when you fall into that mode, that you're operating on the edges, on the extremes.
I think that's a phenomenal way that you put that, because that I'm going to actually use that in the future. If you view it, because you mentioned that it's a spectrum, and if you can see that it's white and black, and that the ego falls somewhere in between that, but the way to get out of that is to involve color in that spectrum and make it a conversation with some higher self, God, universe, divine, whatever you want to put it. Like Jesus would always talk to the Father. Martin Luther King would always talk to Jesus. I mean, even in the Bhagavad Gita, talk to Krishna. There's always got to be some relationship with something higher than, transcending, as we always say, to take you out of the black and white, and to bring color in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Every time you're not adding nuances to a specific part of reality, it's very likely that that's your ego looking at it and not your higher self.
Spot on. All right.
Bruder?
Meine Brüder.
Bruder John, du bist dran. Prost.
Prost.
Prost, Prost.
Cheers.
Cheers.